So this is a week for which it's hard to know what to talk about, except it is Shavuot, so it gives us a way into understanding the world in which we are. And thank you and thank God for the rituals of our lives, for the cycles of these festivals. And I believe they give us a lens always through which to understand the circumstances of our lives. So Shavuot, as we talk about, is the time when we celebrate what we call Zman Matan Toratenu, the giving of the Torah. It's the time of the giving of the Torah, and that's how it's referred to in our liturgy. It's how our rabbinic tradition refers to it. But what exactly was given at Mount Sinai? How do we understand the giving of Torah? So our rabbis and the rabbinic tradition has a lot of different ways to understand this. Some believe that everything we've ever known to be Jewish was given, and all of us were present. Those who were alive then, but every soul who would become Jewish was present at Sinai. We were all there for the giving of the Torah. But the Kotzker Rebbe famously asks the question, why, if we're celebrating the Jewish people receiving the Torah, why don't we call this time, the Zman, the time of the receiving of the Torah? Why do we call Shavuot the time of the giving of the Torah? Why is the focus on the giving and not the focus on the receiving? Because isn't that the point? And we've talked about how the image is that God's presence is always beaming like a radio transmission. And the truth of God's wisdom is always beaming like a radio transmission, but it's up to us to create the receptors, that you would put on top of your roof that would receive the transmission. And if you're not open to receiving, it doesn't matter if the radio transmissions are taking place. So the Kotzker Rebbe said very famously, and this is a really famous insight of his, that the reason that we call it the giving of the Torah, not the receiving of the Torah, is because the giving happened on one day. Zman Matan Toratenu, it's the time of the giving of the Torah. But the truth is, every other day is the day of receiving Torah. It's up to us every single day. We have to, it's up to us. God can only put out those radio beams. God can only send out those radio transmissions. It's turned on. The question is, are we going to do everything we can to be open to those truth? The Torah means teachings. Are we going to be receiving the teaching, not just an obstacle, not just being an obstacle, but are we going to actually remove the obstacles to receiving the truth? So Jack Greenberg beautifully read the Aseret HaDibrot last night, the 10 Commandments, or as some people like to call them, the 10 Suggestions. They're all different ways to refer to them. Immediately after the giving of the 10 Commandments, and it is hard if you've ever seen Charlton Heston to think of it as any other way, but there's a description of what the world is like in the camp of the Israelites. And there's a famous and fantastic phrase that says, V'chol ha'am, and all of the people, ro'im et hakolot. All the people see the sounds or see the voices. So there's a lot of discussion, as you might imagine. What does it mean to see the sounds? The Torah then gets on to describe, and the Midrashim love describing, that there was thunder and there were claps of thunder, and it was very, very, very noisy and dramatic. And then other Midrashim say, no, it wasn't loud and dramatic on a simple level. It wasn't that every word of the Torah was given in the way that we read the Torah. It wasn't that every halacha, it wasn't that everything was given then. In fact, the entire 10 Commandments weren't given. The only thing that was given at Mount Sinai that we celebrate is the first letter of the 10 Commandments, the Aleph. And the Aleph is silent. So this Midrash says, it's not about the loud drama in which we might find God's presence in our lives. It's about embracing the Aleph, embracing the silence. And only in silence will you be able to be open to what God has to teach us. Well, both of these things are probably true, that sometimes we need to be hit over the head. We need great drama to get a new insight, to change our behavior or to understand the world differently. And sometimes we need quiet and peace, and we need absolute rest. So both of those things are the way into whatever it was that God was giving, but how are we going to receive it? It's hard to imagine a time more important than this one to receive God's Torah and God's truth. To remind ourselves that there are some basic truths in the world. This week, for those of us who saw this horrific video, those of us who are white, and last night a great discussion began, are Jews white? Are white Jews white? Because first of all, of course, there are Jews of color, and Jewish life represents a broad range of who people are. But are European Ashkenazic Jews white? Well, in America, where racism has identified Jews of color and people of color as Black, those of us who can walk down the street and not be afraid of the police, those of us who could jog and not be afraid of being killed while jogging, those of us who could do things because our skin is of a lighter hue, we are benefiting from what exists as white privilege in our society, which does not exist in God's Torah. The question is, how will we as Jews, Jews of color and Jews who are not of color, how will we understand the truth that God has to teach us today, the world in which we live, which is so full of pain? One author I turn to a lot to understand the modern world is the historian Heather Cox Richardson, of whom I've spoken and written about in the past. And she wrote, she's a historian, an American historian, and she often does a brilliant job of trying to understand the world through the lens of history. And every night she writes a blog analyzing that day's world, not as a pundit on cable TV and not as an activist in particular, but as an intellectual who's looking through the prism of history. And how does she understand the events of this week? I read briefly from her words. Crucially, in response to what is happening, and in that she's referring to both the violence as well as the fact that COVID-19 is clearly affecting people of color 3 times as much as white Americans, 3 times as much. And that it is people who can't afford to stay inside who are at greatest risk. Largely African Americans and Latino essential workers. We see people who are in meatpacking facilities who are not protected by any laws, who are at great risk. And now this week we see what's been emerging as a contemporary American lynching. And it didn't happen in the South. It happened in the North. Heather Richardson writes, crucially, white Americans are finally paying attention to the violence against the Black community. I suspect the reason, she writes, for this attention is that the current leadership of the Republican Party has gone so far toward consolidating power in favor of an oligarchy that ordinary white Americans are now identifying with marginalized people. This is precisely what happened in the 1850s, when even desperately racist white Americans pushed back for the first time against the elite slave owners taking control of the American government because they recognized that they too could be sacrificed if leaders thought they stood in the way of the economic system that enriched the few. So here we are at this place of the desert. We're in the desert, but we also have God's Torah with us. And we have the ability to continue to be the voice of justice, to be the voice standing up, to be the witness. And witnessing is powerful, as we know from our trip last year to the memorial to lynching in America, that the first thing that we need to do is to witness. Those of us who are white and those of us who are of color, we need to be united, and we need to be clear that we see what is happening. We see that there is a small number who are eagerly and voraciously trying to consolidate power in order to enrich a very small number of Americans. And they will stop at nothing, including using this pandemic to achieve that. I'm very proud that CBST joined with LGBT organizations, dozens and dozens and dozens across America, to issue this following statement. We are in the desert, but God is giving us truth if we are open to hearing it. And a piece of that truth is to survive the desert, that there is a promised land beyond the desert, that this is not the end of the story, and despair is not an option. So let me read these words in full tonight as a piece of the Torah that we are receiving while we're in the desert. And I'm proud that CBST is a part of this document, which as of this afternoon is now being distributed far and wide. And let us remember that truth and justice will prevail. Be the reason that people believe in the goodness of human beings. Do not despair. Do not give up or give in. And please indulge me while I read this statement, to which CBST is a proud signatory. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Those words, written over 30 years ago by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, remind us that indifference can never bridge the divide of hate. And today they should serve as a call of action to all of us and to the movement for LGBTQ equality. This spring has been a stark and stinging reminder that racism and its strategic objective, white supremacy, is as defining a characteristic of the American experience as those ideals upon which we claim to hold our democracy: justice, equality, and liberty. We listen to the haunting pleas of George Floyd for the most basic of human needs, simply breath, as a Minneapolis police officer kneeled with cruel indifference on his neck for 8 minutes. We felt the pain of Breonna Taylor's boyfriend as he called 911 after plainclothes Louisville police kicked down the door of their home and shot her 8 times as she slept in her bed. We watched the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery by white vigilantes in Brunswick, Georgia, aware that they evaded the consequences of their actions until the video surfaced and sparked national outrage. We saw the weaponizing of race by a white woman who pantomimed fear in calling the police on Christian Cooper, a Black gay man birdwatching in Central Park. We have heard and read about the killings of transgender people, Black transgender women in particular, with such regularity, it is no exaggeration to describe it as an epidemic of violence. This year alone, we have lost at least 12 members of our community. Say their names: Dustin Parker, Nulisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Mendez Arocho, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Johanna Metzger, Serena Angelique Velasquez, Ramos, Leila Pelez Sanchez, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, Nina Pope, Hele J. O'Regan, and Tony McDade. All of these incidents are stark reminders of why we must speak out when hate, violence, and systemic racism claim, too often with impunity, Black lives. The LGBTQ movement's work has earned significant victories in expanding the civil rights of LGBTQ people. But what good are civil rights without the freedom to enjoy them? Many of our organizations have made progress in adopting intersectionality as a core value and have committed to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. We, the undersigned, recognize we cannot remain neutral, nor will awareness substitute for action. The LGBTQ community knows about the work of resisting police brutality and violence. We celebrate June as Pride Month because it commemorates, in part, our resisting police harassment and brutality at Stonewall in New York City, and earlier in California, when such violence was common and expected. We remember it as a breakthrough moment when we refuse to accept humiliation and fear as the price of living fully, freely, and authentically. We understand what it means to rise up and push back against a culture that tells us we are less than, that our lives don't matter. Today, we join together again to say Black Lives Matter and commit ourselves to the action those words require. And it is signed by dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of national LGBTQ organizations. So we stand at Sinai. We pray that God is with us, to give us strength to not give up or to not give in, to reach across and to reach within, to reach out to those who are suffering even more than we are. And it is each of our job to figure out who that is. Please, God, be with our community as we are in the desert of this moment in time. Give us the strength to keep doing what it is to be truly recipients of your Torah. Let us be the best ambassadors of that Torah by acting in ways that we know you want us to do each and every day. And I pray for blessings for each of you who are with us tonight. Whether you are here in New York City, in New York State, in this country, or around the world, wherever you are, remember, people are good. And it is up to us to find that goodness within and to keep spreading it without, and to ask God for the strength. And we, in turn to God and say, how long, oh God, how long will this go on? Shabbat Shalom and good Yom Tov, and may this be a festival of revelation for each of you and for each of us. Shabbat Shalom.